Following World War II, nationalists in the Middle East and Africa resorted to terrorism to end colonial rule.
We had to be free. We couldn't be slaves anymore. And we wanted to get our soil back, our farms. We didn't want settlers in this country. We wanted these people to quit.
If you are faced with a colonial regime which denies the people its freedom, which deprives the people of human rights of any kind, you cannot organize a mass movement against it because it will be smashed. You cannot conduct a war, you have no army. The only weapon you have is terrorism.
The First World War is over, and Europe's nations are aching for change. In many countries, the currency is enfeebled, the people are tired. In Germany, the war has crippled millions into poverty, and Adolf Hitler comes to power, promising to sort out the mess. In Italy, it is Mussolini who becomes the new hope for change. But these new forms of ultra-national movements, Nazism and fascism, will just set the stage for the next war, bringing terror and mass murder to an extreme never known to mankind. In the Middle East, the First World War's knots are also about to be untangled. Having replaced the Ottomans, Britain rules as a colonial power over the lives of Arabs and Jews in Palestine. Its authority will soon be challenged. In what became known as the Balfour Declaration, the British promised the Jews a home in Palestine. Tel Aviv streets are filled with Jewish immigrants who escaped the pogroms and hardship of Eastern Europe and Russia, hoping to build a new life. But reality soon shatters the dream. Palestine's Arab majority is furious at the promise of a Jewish homeland, considering Palestine Arab land. Britain tries to appease the Arabs, and in a secret white paper restricts Jewish immigration to Palestine. This infuriates the Jews.
Like the British, we also have something to die for. The land. This is something more valuable than life, and something we will die for.
Britain sends more troops to Palestine to restore order. The Jews know they cannot defeat the British by military means. They must resort to a different type of struggle, urban terrorism.
We knew that this was the only way to build a state. If we hadn't fought the British, there would have been no state.
To fight the British, the Jews form an underground terrorist organization called the Irgun. Their goal was to strike at symbols of British rule.
The Irgun to which I belonged conducted selective terror. They never killed women or children if they could help it. They just killed the soldiers and the officers and the officials of the occupying power, the colonial power. But even then, by accident or not accident, civilians were killed. I stayed in the Irgun for about 4 years. I left the Irgun, which at the time was quite an unusual thing to do. We had an anthem, which one of whose lines said, "We shall be released from the ranks only by death." And we believed in this.
In the 1930s, persecuted by the Nazi regime, thousands of Jews escape from Germany and flee to Palestine. Successive waves of refugees doubled the Jewish population, threatening the Arab majority. Violence soon breaks out.
When we came to 1936, the atmosphere was ready for a sort of a decision, for a sort of a rebellion. It was fear that as long as these things go on, then there is a danger that Palestine one day would go into somebody else from its own owners.
It is a full-scale rebellion by Arabs, a bloodbath, as Arabs attack Jews. Jewish communities are protected by a defensive home guard, the Haganah. But the underground Irgun escalates the violence and launches a campaign of terrorism against the Arabs. The Irgun recruits volunteers, eager to join the struggle despite the danger.
To live in an underground organization like that is an experience which somebody who has not been in it cannot quite understand. It fills your life completely. It gives purpose to your whole life. Every minute in your life, waking or sleeping, you are a member. You live in constant danger.
The key to an effective terrorist campaign is publicity. The Irgun realizes this and makes sure its actions receive widespread exposure. Leaflets publicize the Jewish cause, and warnings before blowing up buildings spread fear, another important element of terrorism. But within the ranks of the Irgun, a militant group breaks away and forms a radical splinter group called the Stern Gang. Working in tiny cells, they gather intelligence and escalate the violence. Their leader is Avraham Stern.
He was on the one hand a fighter, on the other hand a poet. He wrote poems, a man of books.
In the 1930s, Stern is a student at the University of Florence when Italy is in turmoil. Mussolini's fascists roam the streets, inflicting terror and fear. Their tactics and organizational skills impress Stern. He believes in violence to achieve political goals and writes poems glorifying martyrdom.
Stern had become convinced that in order to succeed, a national movement must produce its own martyrs. The British would not live unless forced to do so by a very determined movement which would be ready to form and to produce martyrs. Since Stern was a great idealist, he saw himself as the archetype of martyrs.
In Palestine, the Stern Gang does not hesitate to use ruthless tactics. To support its campaign of terrorism, it blackmails shop owners and robs banks. When 2 Jewish policemen are killed in one of its operations, Palestine's Jews turn against the Stern Gang.
Lots of people were against Stern.
So what? They were afraid it would disturb them, that the British would make problems for them. But a lot of people helped out behind the scenes, in quiet.
But many called you terrorists.
So what? Do you think we were offended?
During World War II, Stern's hatred of the British drove him to consider an alliance with Nazi Germany. In 1941, he sent an envoy to the Nazis to discuss a possible collaboration against their common enemy. The Germans turned down his request. In Palestine, Stern becomes a pariah. Eventually, he is ambushed and killed by the British.
When they became so unpopular that no one was ready to help them, it was a child's play. The leader was caught and killed, and no one cared a damn about it. There was no outcry against him because everybody said it serves him right. He's crazy.
Future Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, an adherent of IRA tactics, inherits the leadership.
My code name was the name of the famous fighter from the Irish Liberation War, Michael Collins. Michael. Michael is Mikhail in Hebrew.
In 1944, the terrorism spreads to Cairo. Lord Moyne, Britain's highest-ranking government official in the Middle East, is assassinated by two of Stern's gunmen. Their murderous act draws the world's attention to Palestine.
Our war was not a war of hatred. It was a war of dedication, of love to Israel's people and land.
In 1945, the Second World War is over. Jewish Holocaust survivors now look toward Palestine as their last refuge. But Britain restricts immigration, turning many ships away. Many refugees are deported to Cyprus. In the wake of the horror of the concentration camps, once again Jews find themselves behind barbed wire. This callous policy inflames the fervor of the Jewish underground, and the Irgun intensifies the fight to expel the British once and for all.
100 Years of Terror will return in a moment here on the History Channel.
A 30-year-old Polish immigrant, Menachem Begin, becomes the Irgun's new leader and strategist. He is the same man who, as Prime Minister of Israel in 1979, will make peace with Egypt. But in the 1940s, his mission is to wage an uncompromising campaign of terrorism against the British. Soon he has a price on his head. He goes underground and changes his appearance. In hiding, he masterminds the Irgun's deadly bombings, not just in Palestine, but aimed at key British targets abroad, the British Embassy in Rome and the Officers' Club in Vienna.
Menachem Begin is a far better and more experienced and skilled student of Michael Collins. Attacks on military centers, using propaganda, mobilizing public opinion. All these are things that Menachem Begin learned from Michael Collins.
The underground radio of the Irgun Spy Leumi. Today, our soldiers, in defense of their country, attacked the enemy's police headquarters.
In 1946, the main Jewish underground, the Haganah, blows up key bridges across the Jordan River, slowing down the transfer of more British troops to Palestine. The British respond with a massive crackdown. On Saturday, June 29th, in a wave of random raids, they confiscate piles of weapons and arrest thousands. The day will be remembered by Jews as the Black Sabbath. Soon the Irgun will take revenge with an act of terror that shakes Britain to its core. Jerusalem, July 22nd, 1946. Britain's High Command controls Palestine from the top floor of the exclusive King David Hotel. It is just before noon. Lunch is being prepared in the basement kitchen. Disguised as Arab porters, 4 Irgun members struggled to wheel in a delivery of 7 heavy milk containers. No one suspects anything unusual. This happens at the same time every day. Only this special delivery contains 350 kilograms of explosives. The Irgun issues a warning to the hotel's inhabitants, giving them exactly 22 minutes to evacuate. In just a few seconds, a wing of the King David comes crashing down. The explosion strikes indiscriminately. 91 die, British soldiers, Arabs, and Jewish bystanders. 45 others are injured. The campaign of terror has reached a new level. It is one of the world's most lethal terrorist incidents in the 20th century.
The struggle in Palestine became a worldwide phenomenon with great attention drawn to it. Many terrorists in the future will go back to Menachem Begin, will read the revolt, will read the memoirs, will read the press. So in this respect, they are a link in a large chain of terrorism for national liberation, which will develop after many years after they've gone.
Soviet Union,
In desperation, Britain turns to the United Nations for a solution to the problem. The British realize the futility and the cost of trying to govern Palestine.
The resolution.
In November 1947, the UN General Assembly votes to partition Palestine into two independent states, one Arab and one Jewish. The Jews accept it, the Arabs do not. The plan is thus doomed to failure. But the State of Israel is born. The Jews celebrate in the streets on land that is now theirs, a Jewish sovereign state. Britain renounces its mandate and abandons the country, leaving behind a raging conflict between Arabs and Jews. Terrorism was instrumental in ending British rule in Palestine, and the lesson is learned in other colonies where the British flag flies high and proud.
100 Years of Terror will return in a moment here on the History Channel.
Decades to catch on. From the History Channel, the official network of every millennium. This is TimeLab 2000. In 1893, Whitcomb Judson patents the clasp locker and displays it at a world exposition as a modern-day wonder. He sells exactly 20 of them to the Postal Service. Not a big hit. Dr. Gideon Sunback redesigns the device for World War I uniforms, but they rust shut after washing. After a few more improvements in 1923, B.F. Goodrich buys 170,000 for galoshes. They're dubbed zippers after the sound they make. Soon they're sewn into pants and finally get popular. Zippers, the not-so-modern-day wonder we eventually learned to love. For the History Channel, I'm Sam Waterston.
The History Channel now returns to 100 Years of Terror.
In the 1950s, the drive for independence spreads to the British colony of Kenya. Life for the white settlers is good under British rule, and they show little concern for the natives' daily struggle to survive. The Africans live in segregated, shabby slums. The Kikuyu, the dominant African tribe in Kenya, want the British out, and their call is spreading.
We're looking at a country in the early 1950s of about 40,000 whites, some 2,750 very large white farms, and an African population of about 5 million.
We were living in abject poverty. I realized that we were kind of under slave labor. At that time, I didn't know any other behavior, and I didn't know any other way.
The white settlers had no intention of leaving Kenya. Colonial rule made it easy for them to exploit the natives, paying them meager wages to work on their huge plantations. But not far from the gaze of their bosses, a ruthless movement is growing from the grassroots. It would be known as the Mau Mau. Angry and desperate young Mau Mau terrorists arm themselves with long machetes called pangas. Their first targets are collaborators, fellow Kikuyus who work for and are loyal to the British. Their tactics are brutal, dismemberment and mutilation. Their intent is to spread fear among the white settlers, to spread fear with the panga.
You realize that we wanted freedom. And then there are some of us who are collaborating with the white people. And they go and give them information about what we are doing. So we had to fight. It was a fight. So it didn't discriminate against anybody who was a traitor, anybody who was a policeman who is fighting us or killing us. It was either you or me.
The Mau Mau movement was not a highly organized movement. It was not pyramidal in structure at all. It did not have a coherent chain of command from the top going down to the bottom. There were many, many leaders, and many of those leaders were rivals within the movement itself. But they were true revolutionaries. They were committed. They had taken their oaths. There was no turning back. There was no compromise.
recruits are required to take part in a ritual oath-taking ceremony that binds them to the Mau Mau as a secret society. Their strategy is to terrorize, to kill cattle and sheep, burn crops and plantations, and when they kill, to kill brutally. Soon the Mau Mau will become known for their savagery. In October 1952, Britain declares a state of emergency. Only a handful of white settlers have been killed so far by the Mau Mau. But hundreds of Kikuyu accused of collaborating with the British are mutilated and murdered. The British respond harshly, rounding up suspects and sending them to detention camps. For the first time in decades, white settlers feel unsafe walking the streets of Nairobi. Many arm themselves, wary that any white man, woman, or child could be the next victim of a Mau Mau attack. In 1952, a turning point. The British arrest Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya's recognized political leader, and sent him into exile. Britain's governor in Kenya, Sir Evelyn Baring, orders the arrest of hundreds of suspected terrorists and pushes the Kikuyus back into their traditional reserves. The tactic will soon backfire.
I sympathize with Mau Mau. Although, to be honest, I don't believe that I sympathize in some of the methods they later used.
January 24th, 1953. It is a sunny afternoon, and family servant Kimaniwa K is watching over 4-year-old Michael Ruck as he plays happily outside the Nairobi family home. K is trusted by his boss, Roger Ruck, to look after the child as if his own. Suddenly, the boy falls off the swing, and K faithfully steps in. Cradling Michael, he carries him upstairs and gently nurses his wounds. Later that evening, Kay helps the Rucks settle into their evening routine, light dinner, chat, and some soothing music. But Kay is waiting to give a different signal. At night, he goes out and waves to his colleagues that the way is clear. Roger, his wife Esma, and little Michael are unsuspecting as Kay opens the gate and leaves clear the path to little Michael's cot. Daybreak reveals the full horror of the cold-blooded massacre. The Mau Mau has slaughtered Roger Ruck, his wife, and little son. To eliminate any evidence of their crime, they kill Kay as well. The massacre sends a chilling warning to the British. Now they are burying an entire settler family, betrayed by a loyal servant in the heart of their home. The savage murder spreads fear and terror. The British respond with a massive crackdown. Every Kikuyu is considered a potential Mau Mau terrorist. Villages are emptied, entire families are marched away, and trucks of Kikuyu taken back to their reserves in the deep forests of the Aberdare and Mount Kenya. The order is clear: terrorize the terrorists.
The British wanted to teach the Africans a lesson. They wanted the counterinsurgency to be so violent that Africans in other British colonies, like southern Rhodesia, would be less inclined to stage a similar insurrection. They wanted it to be brutal and graphic. They wanted to spread terror among the African population to try to discourage other Africans from joining in this insurrection.
The security forces put the local people under some very, very stringent conditions. Some of them were even almost shot aside.
There were many difficult times, but the one I take very ill, is most difficult was when I was a detainee in Lamu Island, when I was raped by a white police officer. I was raped.
Despite the horrors and brutality on both sides, British newsreels put a positive spin on their reports from Kenya.
Now Kenya, another of the many trouble spots in the world today. Members of the parliamentary delegation investigating the Mau Mau problem flew over a prison camp for Kikuyus. Most of these people have been arrested for comparatively minor crimes in connection with Mau Mau activities. It's hoped they can be convinced of the error of their ways by a process of rehabilitation. These loyal Kikuyu have even formed their own band, which parades in great style and makes music too.
March 27th, 1953. The sun rises to reveal the gutted village of Lari. Hours earlier, 1,000 Mau Mau terrorists went on a rampage, hunting collaborators. Huts were locked with steel wire, then set ablaze, women and children still asleep inside. They slaughtered men, women, and children with pangas, leaving bodies cut in half. "97 were killed, 32 severely burned. Lari was a stronghold of Africans loyal to the British. The message was clear. Those suspected of the outrage are swiftly rounded up and paraded before the world. A public trial of the terrorists creates sympathy for the British desire to remain in Kenya. Photos of the massacre are released to the world's newspapers in an attempt to manipulate international public opinion.
The British were almost looking forward, I believe, to a massacre of that kind, that they could really photograph extensively and say to the world, look, this is, see what's happening? These Mau Mau rebels are a vicious, savage people. And it tended to reinforce an image of Africans that actually dates back to the era of the slave trade at the turn of the last century. The idea of Africans as being fundamentally savages, violent people. And so it strengthened those images.
By 1956, several thousand more British troops land in Kenya to intensify the war against the Mau Mau. Attack planes hammer away at terrorist strongholds in the Kenyan forests. Guerrilla leaders flee to the mountains as a last resort, but still come under attack. The Mau Mau is on the run, desperate and starved. The British can taste victory.
The search for Dedan Kimathi ended at Nyeri police station after the Mau Mau leader had been captured. He was trying to escape into the forest, which has known his reign of terror ever since the emergency began 4 years ago. Leopard skins were the badge of his evil office. His capture is a powerful blow at the weakening morale of those few gangsters still trying to evade the security net which is inevitably closing round them.
Kimathi is executed in 1957 and becomes a martyr. But winds of change are in the air. The British government has become impatient with the duration and the cost of the struggle. Political leader Jomo Kenyatta is brought back from exile, hoping to negotiate an end to the hostilities. The Mau Mau may have lost the battle, but they have won the war. Independence is granted in 1963. Jomo Kenyatta becomes Kenya's first president. Surprisingly, only 32 white settlers were killed during the years of terrorism. But 25,000 British troops were drawn into the war. 13,500 Mau Mau were killed. Their legacy of brutal terrorism will remain controversial for many years.
100 Years of Terror will return in a moment here on the History Channel.
In North Africa, Algeria has been a French colony since 1834. Its settlers, a privileged elite, consider it a part of France. In 1954, Algerian Arabs begin their bloody revolt against French rule. It starts with terrorist attacks in rural areas. The French respond with devastating force. French bombers attack Arab villages. Armored troops crush resistance. At the time, there are 400,000 French soldiers in Algeria. The Nationalist Liberation Front, the FLN, numbers a few thousand with limited support. France's show of force delivers a clear message. It has no intention of leaving Algeria. Entire Muslim villages are punished for supporting the FLN. Men are separated from their families, rounded up and sent to detention camps. Women and children are packed off to the Algerian mountains. France's repressive strategy will leave a deep scar for generations to come.
On s'est dit, mais qu'est-ce qu'on est allé faire là-bas? Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait finalement?
We should have thought about it and not done what we did. We should have acted the way the British did in India. They gave the Indians freedom, and everything turned out far better than it did for us in North Africa. We failed to understand, even though we knew that politics would be the eventual answer to the end of the war. It still hurts to think you've lost years of your life, were injured and saw your friends die for nothing.
French troops pour into the cities to arrest suspected terrorists. The Arabs respond with protests and strikes, and an unusual terrorist tactic.
J'ai vu une autre forme de terroriste qui m'avait frappé, que nous avions des Arabes, des commerçants.
We saw a different type of terrorism. Arab vendors used to come into the towns. They usually sold cakes and food, but buried in the cakes were razor blades. There were plenty of soldiers badly injured after swallowing the razor-bladed cakes. This was the first type of terror I experienced.
The Kasbah of Algiers, nearly 100,000 Muslims packed into an area of less than 2 square miles. It is from deep within this slum that the FLN leaders will recruit and build terrorist cells. Suspicious of trouble, the French army imposes curfews and heavy restrictions on movements. The Arabs call for strikes, which bring the capital to a standstill. To defeat the FLN, the French turn to one of their toughest and most decorated officers, General Jacques Messou.
This was a mission for the military, and this mission was carried out successfully.
The violence, the colonized system of violence, could only be answered by violence. The violence had to be the only point of reciprocity between the colonial and the colonized was violence, and that had to be the answer. You're not going to beat the French militarily, and they don't. It's impossible. You have 400,000 troops there. So the point is to destabilize the nation, to make it not just non-profitable, but unpleasant for the French to be there any longer.
In our next hour, the amazing history of garbage on Modern Marvels.
Turns to 100 Years of Terror.
Moi, dans 3 mois, je me tire.
Et là, regarde. Halte!
These are scenes from a film called The Battle of Algiers. Made after independence, it accurately recreates the FLN's terrorist campaign, masterminded by Youssef Sadi, who plays himself.
I was the chief commander, the political and military chief of the autonomy zone of Algiers. We did small actions to begin with, to become known, and then expanded the war, attacking military posts and so on. Actually, it's like it happens now, here.
Youssef Saadi and his urban cadres unleash a reign of unprecedented bombings and terror. The FLN targeted popular bars and bistros and crowded city streets. In 1 month alone, French soldiers cleared debris from 120 explosions that rock the Algerian capital. The French response is brutal. Torture of both terrorists and suspected terrorists becomes routine.
The French reaction to the FLN's actions were so enormous and so indiscriminate that if 1 or 2 Europeans were murdered, thousands of people would be tortured or terrorized or murdered indiscriminately. And out of those thousands, 1 might be a member of the FLN. So you're bringing into the war all these people that perhaps in the past weren't particularly involved in the war.
The political leader of the FLN, Ahmed Ben Bella, directs the terrorist campaign from his headquarters in Cairo. In Algeria, he is #1 on the French most wanted list. But in October 1956, Ben Bella makes a crucial error of judgment. Along with other FLN leaders, he boards a Moroccan aircraft in Cairo on a secret funding mission to Morocco. French intelligence is aware of the flight. Flying over Algerian airspace, the aircraft is intercepted and ordered to land in Algeria. Ben Bella is arrested and sent to Paris, where he will spend the next 7 years in prison. With the French near victory in the Battle of Algiers, sympathetic allies Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt provide the rebels with arms. The French are able to confiscate just a trickle of what gets through. But it's not just guns that are smuggled into Algeria. Foreign revolutionary volunteers have infiltrated and are now taking part in the terrorism. The French uproot more than 1 million Muslims from their homes, deporting them to resettlement camps.
The irony is that these resettlement camps become hotbeds for FLN activities. Here you have all these people uprooted from their land, from their homes, etc., willing to sort of become nationalist agitators, willing to sort of take on board the idea, yes, we must get rid of the French immediately. You know, so they, again, another massive sort of brutal, inhuman sort of way of dealing with a problem. Adds to the problem.
They tried all possible means to stop terrorism. But the more they harassed the people, the more the people joined the FLN.
With checkpoints on every street corner, it becomes impossible to move undetected in Algiers, let alone to smuggle weapons. The Arab women respond to the challenge.
Now we wonder, how could we have managed without the women? It was a big risk. They smuggled everything. If they got caught, it was no small matter. In the imagination and mentality of the French soldier at the checkpoint, this was crucial. He could not imagine that a woman with a veil and a certain religious code, who normally would not leave the boundaries of her home, would hide anything.
French reprisals are no less ruthless. Women are arrested, tortured, even executed. But this does not deter the notorious Saadi's girls, as they come to be called. Youssef Saadi devises the strategy of using young female operatives. He correctly guesses that women would arouse far less suspicion than men, but they are no less effective and no less ruthless. They target civilians, families, even women and children, at a seaside resort, a downtown cafeteria, and the Air France passenger terminal. The violence unleashed by Saadi's girls does not just shock the French. Many Algerian Muslims are appalled by the indiscriminate terrorist attacks. Hundreds of suspected terrorists are arrested and deported to French prisons. On June 9, 1957, Yousef Saadi carries out his last and most daring attack. As French Algerians dance the night away in an exclusive nightclub, a bomb explodes under the band's stage, killing 10 and injuring 80. 3 months later, Yousef Saadi is captured. He is tried and sentenced to death. His sentence would later be commuted. Back in France, desperate politicians call upon the renowned Charles de Gaulle to become president and win the war once and for all. Instead, in a surprising change of heart, the new president promises to end the conflict and let Algeria choose its own destiny, as he pledges a referendum on self-determination. He calls it the peace of the brave.
Before the human race today are only two roads: the war or brotherhood in Algeria. In Algeria, like everywhere else, France has chosen brotherhood.
But in Algeria, de Gaulle's declaration enrages hardline army officers who see it as a betrayal. The dismissal of General Jacques Massou for opposing de Gaulle's policy triggers a major crisis. Thousands of French Algerians demonstrate to support Massou. Rioters clash with police in a bloody melee. Algerians are watching as Frenchmen are taking up arms against Frenchmen. Right-wing colonials and extremists in the military form their own terrorist group, the OAS, or Secret Army Organization. Once again, bombs explode on Algeria's streets as the OAS carries out a ruthless terrorist campaign against the FLN and the French government. It now rivals the FLN in sheer brutality, and hundreds of Muslims are killed. The OAS tries to drive a wedge between Arabs and Europeans, but in reality, it turns Algeria into a living nightmare.
When the OAS arrived, everyone was in danger. Everyone.
Frenchman George Atwell was one of many who got caught between the two rival terror groups. It was in 1961. Anarchy hit Algiers, and city life crashed to a halt. Random raids and kidnapping mean hundreds will never be seen again. Fear of the other side soars to ghastly dimensions. The FLN come up with a slogan for the French: the suitcase or the coffin.
Either you take your suitcase and disappear, or you're dead in a coffin. That was what the FLN used to say to the French.
In 1961, terrorists strike in Paris. On April the 27th, 5 bombs explode in French railway stations and at Orly International Airport. The war, once 1,000 miles away, has come home to France. The French finally have had enough. In March 1962, a ceasefire is negotiated. FLN leader Ahmed Ben Bella is released from prison. He would become the first president of an independent Algeria. De Gaulle's referendum is held on July the 4th, 1962. The Algerian people speak with one voice. They vote for independence. The price of independence is high. 17,500 French soldiers killed. The Muslim toll is even higher. 150,000 dead. But soon, Algeria's success will serve as an example to other revolutionary groups. And before long, activists from other guerrilla movements and new terror organizations will flock here to learn exactly how they did it.